So a lot of folks don't know this, and that's what actually came up when we started using the term healing from whiteness, is that, and people didn't know that this is actually something that was constructed, a social construct that was made in the early 19th century by wealthy land-owning Northwestern European elites, folks from England, Denmark, and that area. And so the purpose of this was to make sure that the non-wealthy folks from other European countries like Ireland or Italy made sure that they did not actually get together with Black folks and Native folks in the Americas, right? Because they actually had a lot more in common with each other, because they were all being pretty exploited and oppressed for the personal gain of these land-owning elites, right? And so what happened was that, because previously folks were just, they were Irish American, they were English American, right? Or they're still just English immigrants, settlers. And so what happened was that when the sense of whiteness was created, and that brought folks from the continent of Europe together in the Americas, like, poor Europeans in their sense actually gained white privilege, but then they lost connection to their cultural heritage. They lost connection to their own history, of their own struggle, right? And why they left their countries to come across on boats to the United States, where a lot of them didn't make it, or it was generally an awful trip, obviously, and to come to a land that was obviously hostile, right? Because they were occupying it. Right? They're invading it. And then once they got here, so you gotta think, this was their best option, right? And which gets me to think about, well, what was so terrible in Europe that this coming to the United States and going through all this was actually their best option?
Persecution.
Well, yeah, but they didn't know how rough things were in America, first and foremost. They were told that it's this great place that's free, or well, actually, they weren't told it was free. It was just a new land of opportunity, that there were jobs there.
That you could go there and just build a house somewhere and live. You could start a whole new life. And that's not the way it was, because when they showed up, the land had already been divided up among the wealthy people. And if you wanted land, you had to buy it from them. And they weren't selling. They were accepting indentured servants, serfs.
And, the reason why people left left Europe was because of persecution. Exactly that. There were people who faced, going to jail because they couldn't pay their taxes, because they were poor. They kept, overtaxing people, and people just wanted out.
Yeah, that's why debtor's prison was made illegal in America in, 1865, because there were so many people that were fleeing because they were overtaxed so much that they were so in debt that they were in danger of going to prison. So they left and came to America, and one of the first things that they did was, okay, if you owe a debt, you can't be thrown in jail. You just owe a debt.
There was also religious persecution. Like my family, like I talked about, they were Protestants in a Catholic regime where, in some cases you could be killed for being the wrong religion. And this did happen in Europe, and people wanted away. We often credit the Puritans as being the first colony in America from Europe. The Puritans were leaving because they weren't given the freedom to practice the religion they wanted. Now, admittedly, their religion was a bit out there, if you ask me. Do you really know any Puritans remaining anymore? But that's why they left, because they wanted the freedom to practice the religion that they believed in and couldn't. So they left. So there was a lot of reasons why people left Europe, but it was mostly for the opportunity to have a new life. That's why they left for the most part.
I mean, you had the Irish potato famine, which was a large cause of why a massive amount of Irish immigrated to America. I mean, there were a ton of things that were going on that caused people to move. It wasn't like they're playing it out. There were a lot of different factors. and none of them were good for the white people who were leaving. That's why they left.
So, no, they didn't know about the hardships that they were coming to face. They were trying to get away from hardships. So, and you still haven't explained how Europeans gained white privilege and lost their connection to their cultural heritage, which I'm glad you admit that white people do have heritage, although I guess what they say specifically is that Americans don't have heritage. But they lost their connection to their heritage and gained white privilege. How did they gain white privilege? By coming to America? Was coming to America immediately how one gained their privilege? Or did they do something else to gain it? Because it sounds like to me that when you came here, if you didn't have a lot of money, you're treated just as bad as the slaves, if not worse in some cases.
Because you were expendable. It's like if you have a child, you are required to make sure that that child gets the things that it needs to survive. But if we're talking about like someone on the other side of the world, you owe nothing to them. You are not responsible for their existence. That's the way it was I don't owe you anything, so tough it out.
Knowing the likelihood they might die, right? If not them, their children, half their children maybe. I mean, the rate of mortality was so high back in the day, right? And so what happened is that they lost their connection with that struggle, with the history of why they came to the United States and what their experience was being exploited and oppressed by the wealthy landowners. And because they got pitted against people of color, because they got a little extra benefit, not as much obviously as the wealthy landowners, but they got at least to be white and not to be a person of color, right? So that really cut off their humanity and connection to folks who actually were in much more similar situations, right? So this is something to really kind of think about. This is not something that I think most folks in this country are very conscious about. We don't get taught this history. You got to think about why we don't get taught it.
I'll agree that we're not really taught this history, but because we still focus on the victim narrative. But my fucking God, are you stupid? I mean, they gained their white privilege by coming to America because they were treated slightly better than slaves. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. Like we said, a slave at least had access to some food. A poor person didn't necessarily have access to food. Like, if they were living on the streets, there were no programs out there to really help them. Unless a local church decided to do something, but that's not really enough.
And they say that these people came to America and were given whiteness. Well, that's not true, because the Irish in the 17 and 1800s were actually not considered white. You can actually read it in written law in America. It's talked about in the movie Gangs of New York. The Irish were not considered white.
And pardon the term, but we kind of whitewash history, wash away like all the real struggles that white people had to face coming here. When we talk about American history, at least when I went through history in, grade school, we talked about how the Puritans came here because of religious persecution, and then there were slaves, and then the Native Americans, and, whatnot. And then we moved west to, like, the gold rush. I mean, we went through quite a bit because there's a lot of American history to cover and so little time to do it. You have to skip around a lot, but we don't get to hear about the nitty-gritty stuff that's happening. It sounds like you're a victim of that as well, is that either you're purposely not hearing about how hard it was to be white in the new Americas, or you were never taught this. I can't speak for Josh here, but I know a lot about this because I go back and I study it. I look up things all the time. I can't help it. I mean, leave me alone for an hour and you'll probably find me on Wikipedia, or porn in Wikipedia. But I love learning, and I just learn everything I can, especially in dealing with toxic feminist harpies like these women here because they're all claiming about this history that doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's like, oh, these people were given white privilege when they came to America. Yeah, well, white privilege doesn't feed you. It doesn't keep you warm when it's winter. It just, you say, oh, I'm white. That doesn't really do anything for you. It's not like if you showed up at a tavern or something and you needed a place to stay and food to eat, you couldn't just go in and go, well, I'm white, so that means I get a free room and free food. It wasn't like that.
But we live in the legacy of it, right? We live in this legacy, and so we don't exist in a vacuum, right? So there's a reason why you experience what you experience. There's a reason why you feel the way that you feel. And learning our history and how things were created for the current context that we live in, this is all part of the work, right? So, and I think it's super important to always remember that racism was a tool, and it still continues to be a tool, particularly by the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party is not that great either. But was a tool that was used to keep us distracted from how the ruling elite has been running have been running our societies, right? For their own personal benefit. Like the percentage of folks who actually own the majority of the U.S., for example, is very small, right? Most of us are very much struggling. The middle class in the United States have really, really bottomed out, right? And so we just have to keep in mind that when we think about, for example, affirmative action, right? For example, we want to talk about there being meritocracy, and so some folks, like Abigail Fisher, goes after affirmative action, when in reality, affirmative action has most helped white women to get into positions, to get into jobs, and get into college. And we don't look at legacy, right? We don't look at legacy. We don't look at athletes who make their campuses or universities money, right? So things that are tied to wealthier folks, to earning money for folks. You got to really think about, why is there racism at play? Who's benefiting, right? It's all about power at the end of the day and distribution of resources and power. So I just want to throw that out there. I know I'm throwing out a lot, but there's a lot of context for this work, right? And so I want to really expand upon why, this notion that white people need to liberate themselves from white supremacy is not one that's often discussed. It's usually that white people need to help, people of color, right, and to save them from racism, right? And it's a sense that the racism is happening over there, like outside. It's not inside of us, right? It's not inside of white folks, right? And that's not really what we're talking about, actually. What we need is to understand that white supremacy was something that was taught to all of us, right? It was something that was taught to all of us. People of color, we have our own personal experiences and our collective histories that counter the lies that white supremacy taught us. However, white folks don't have that unless they proactively sought it out. They've been intentionally kept ignorant of it, right?
Based on what? What are you basing that off? Are you making a generalization that all white people just don't know? I mean, that's the only way that you could make that kind of statement, is if you're making a generalization of an entire race of people that they're ignorant. You know what we call that? Racism.
They're just completely oblivious.
You're being racist to all white people, saying that they're ignorant of history. They're ignorant of all of this. That they're ignorant of the viewpoint that you have. Well, technically, yeah, they are ignorant of that, but you're trying to say that they should know and they don't because they're purposely, not taught the right way. It's elitism, it's racism.
It's like everything that they claim to espouse, they're doing on a regular basis.
Yeah, pretty much, exactly. We're 30 minutes into a 90-minute video, or 20 minutes in. And yeah, they're going through an introduction, but they're wasting a lot of time talking about this or talking about that. And it's like, well, when are we going to get to the part about healing from our toxic whiteness?
They're just talking around in a big circle just to fill time.
Pretty much. they're making a huge generalization about all of this and hoping no one is going to pay attention. And if they do, they must be white supremacists.
If you seek debate, then somehow you're a supremacist.
And she says the Democratic Party is not that great.
Maybe she should look into the history and she'll see that the Republican Party has been a lot better towards the black community than the Democrat Party has.
That is very true. It was a rude awakening when I got taught it. I was like, I thought the Democrats were for, civil rights and all of that. And it's like, no, that's what they want you to believe, but that's not actually true. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat either. I'm a liberal, but not an ultra-liberal or radical liberal. I'm like the actual definition of a liberal. Although some have called me a libertarian, but I don't know about that. It's funny how history is, because it's taught on how we want you to believe it is and how it actually is. And what's funny is the information is out there to go look for yourself.
Yep, it's not hard to find.
A lot of people criticize Wikipedia, but, for me, Wikipedia is a good starting point. It's a start of knowledge, not the end of knowledge. You go from there and you double check everything that's said on Wikipedia, but for the most part, it gets things within the general vicinity of the truth. Sometimes it's accurate, yeah. And so start there. Start reading up on there. Yes, anyone can edit it. And yes, a lot of feminists do try to invade in there and try to change things to their way. But if you look up, other resources beyond their claims, you can find out if it's actually true or not. It requires a little bit of work on your end, but the history is out there. It'd be one thing if the establishment was hiding the history, but, they found a better way of doing that. By making everyone uneducated.
It's basically like if you keep telling yourself, I'm sick, I'm sick, I'm sick, eventually you will get sick. Well, the Democrat Party just kept saying, we're the party of the people, we're fixing things, we're trying to make everything better for everyone. They just kept saying that so much that people just started believing it.
And so it's just as the people of color need to do the internal work to free ourselves from internalized oppression, internalized racism, white people also need to do the same, right? And the first step, of course, is to understand that you too have been unconsciously conditioned to think and act in everyday racist ways, right? And the lie that how white supremacy taught that being a racist is one of the worst things that you can be. So you're either a good person who's not racist or you're a bad person who's not racist. The fact of the matter is we all have these biases, right? And the question is, what are we going to do about it? And then we also need to think about what has happened to us that make us not care in the face of violence. What has happened to the emotional system of people who will deny that racism was at play when 12-year-old boys are gunned down by police, right? Or little girls in their own homes, right?
12-year-old boys are gunned down in the street. Well, how about you stop buying them realistic-looking BB guns? How about you tell them, hey, maybe you shouldn't point something that looks like a gun at a cop?
Or how about, if you are, keep the fucking orange tab on?
Yeah, that there was a law created to make sure that people could look at a BB gun and say, that's a BB gun. That's not an actual gun. And if you purposely remove that orange plastic tab from the tip of it, you're endangering your life. You're taking your life into your own hands. You do not know how someone else is going to react when you pull out something that looks like a real gun and point it at them.
You're going on with this, well, white supremacists teach that being racist is bad. Why is that a bad thing? Should white supremacists not teach that racism is bad? Should they teach that racism is good?
Yeah, I didn't understand that when she was saying that. She's like, white supremacists are saying that racism is bad. Okay. Where's the negative?
I think the point she's getting at, which she's doing very poorly, is that she's saying that while they say on one hand racism is bad, on the other hand they encourage racism. So they keep saying it's bad, but it's actually perpetrating racism. Kind of like the aliens on Mars attack that, you know, the translator is like, don't run, we're your friends, as they're killing them. Yak, 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 yak. So, I mean, I guess that's what they're trying to suggest, is that where the aliens from Mars attacks, like, racism is bad while we're killing them.
Even the killing of children, right, is still being like, oh, well, that's probably justified, right? There's probably some reason, right? So we got to really think about this, and what have we cut ourselves off from in order to continue to be in denial, right? Because when we cut ourselves off from that pain of acknowledging the violence and happening in front of us, right, that's cutting ourselves off from ourselves, right? And so the work is about restoring ourselves to emotional wholeness. And that's why, you know, the work is individual, which will lead to an individual personal liberation, which will then lead to a collective liberation, right? But the work starts with yourself. And that's what this program is about. That's what this workshop is about. It's not about doing stuff out there, like doing the stuff, taking care of your own house, that will lead to being able to do the stuff out there. But you gotta start with yourself, right? Because that's all you got, actually. So compassion activism, the program, the model that I've developed is really about how do we relate to our unconscious conditioning in a different way, right? Because oftentimes what we know is to police, to punish, to judge, and shame. And we're not trying to perpetuate the same dynamics that we're trying to dismantle, right? These are the dynamics of systemic oppression. And instead, we're talking about how can we hold the space for ourselves to sit with all the pain, the grief, and the fear that comes up when we start to examine our own implicit biases and how we've been complicit and benefited from systemic oppression, right? And so the only way out is through, is what I often say when it comes to healing. We cannot jump over living in a racist society to being, oh, I'm anti-racist completely and 100% just because I don't believe in racism, right? No, we got to go through it. We got to unpack this.
Why not? Why can't you say that you're completely against racism and you're fighting against racism? Why is it like, well, you're white, so you're not actually against racism, you're part of the problem? If they're saying, I want to be part of the solution.
It's the whole concept of it's never enough. You have not paid enough for what has happened in the past.
It's like the whole appropriations thing. It's like, you know, okay, if I give you money, what's to stop your descendant from asking money from my family again? Is there some official document I can sign that specifically states that my family has paid its debt to you? Or is this that I always have to pay for something that my ancestors didn't even actually do, but say that they actually did? You know, I have to always pay for that? I mean, it's unfortunate that it happened. But, you know, while it did happen, it did bring you to this country. You're alive today because your ancestors were brought here as slaves. Whereas, more than likely, if they weren't brought here as slaves, they would have been slaves in Africa. And you would have been maybe living in Africa right now as a slave.
Or never even born.
Right. Because as bad as things here were in America for slaves, I can only imagine how worse it was in Africa for slaves. I mean, there are some parts of Africa that still have children as slaves, either working the fields or sex slaves. You're not in that environment.
You're in a relatively safe environment that actually does provide for you. As opposed to, you could be living in a country that either doesn't care that you exist or isn't even aware that you exist. And if you die, who cares? That's what you could be living in, is a screwed up country. But instead, you're living in America. It's called the silver lining. Every dark cloud has a silver lining.
Right? That's how we can choose. We can take what's unconscious, when we bring it forward, we can choose not to do it. But if it lives here in unconscious, it drives us from fear, from pain, from anger, right? That's what drives us. Instead, we can take it, we can look at it, and we can be like, hey, this is what I think. This racist belief is what I hold. I don't want to act like this. I don't want to believe in this. And then we can set it aside and choose to do something different, right? So that's what this work is about. So we're a little bit low on time, so we're going to skip ahead to get started. So I want to talk about, so I'll keep talking about pain, right? And how we haven't really talked about the pain, so I'm going to get to it. So there are 3 core pains that I took different readings and whatnot and distilled it down to what felt like 3 core pains, right?
This makes no sense. So the 3 core pains of caused by white supremacists is disconnection from reality and disconnection from people of color. So you have no connection to people of color. You are disconnected from yourself and your emotional system. So you're an unfeeling bastard who's in denial, who's disconnected from people of color, but disconnected from white people. So as a white person, I'm disconnected from everyone, including myself? What are you basing this on? I mean, where do you get off to even claim any of this? You're not citing any of your work. It's like you're making this up off the top of your head and then wrote a PowerPoint slide based off of it.
And another thing is, they've only got 3 things of how it's negatively affecting white people. These 3 things, it's like, yeah, it's negatively affecting you, but it's only in these 3 little ways, whereas there's a whole lot more ways it's affecting other people that are not white. It's like, and these 3 things, disconnection from reality, yourself and your emotional system. I have emotions. I know myself. I know other white people and have a connection to them. I know black people and have a connection to them.
But do you really? I mean, do you really have a connection to them? Because that's what they would say.
Yeah, like all of this stuff can easily be disproven just by looking at yourself and saying, okay, I have emotions. I have white friends. I have black friends. No, none of this is true. Either that or I'm some type of anomaly.
But then if we can't be sure of ourselves, then how can we be sure of them?
Schrodinger's cat. Do you really exist?
Because, well, it's kind of like that movie, what was it, Dark Star? Or something like that, where they're trying to get a bomb not to go off that has an AI, and they convince it that because it can't truly judge what reality is, how can it know that its orders are legitimate? And it feels like that's what they're trying to do to us, to white people. It's like, well, how can you be sure of anything? And, you know, it's like the conclusion in the film is that the bomb's like, well, I can't be sure of anything, and I was only built for one purpose as a bomb, so I'm just going to blow up. That's my one purpose. But, you know, there's a good distinction there in that if they're telling us that everything that we think and feel that we know is wrong, and it's like, well, how can you know you are being, you were raised in a biased system, so there's no way for you to know. It's like they're wanting us to take their version of the red pill. But the thing is if everything I believe is wrong, if everything I've been ever told is a lie, then how can I ever trust you? How do I know you're not lying to me if everything else is lying to me? Because you happen to be telling me a truth? Well, it's your truth. You've not shown me any evidence to support this. And in fact, the things that I've been told before has been presented to me as evidence.
Yeah. It's the expanded version of Schrodinger's cat. It's the last man. Because it's, I exist because you perceive me. Now, I can't guarantee that you exist because you've already perceived me. You're guaranteeing my existence, so someone else has to perceive you. And then someone has to perceive them. And it keeps going down the line, and eventually you get to the end of the line where there's one last person and there's no one left to perceive them. So then that calls into question everyone that's been previously perceived to exist. It's all you can't guarantee anything because there is something at the end that causes it all to fall apart.
Well, then we throw existentialism into the mix and say, well, how do I know that what I'm seeing is actually a person and not a figment of my imagination?
Yep.
And I just feel like this is what they're trying to do to white people, and the problem is it's like, you can't trust anything you've ever been told except for us.
It's psychobabble bullshit.
And fortunately, I study psychology, so I know when I'm being bullshitted.
The first one is the disconnection, right? And these are all just connections because I believe that, we are naturally whole and there's original oneness amongst us, right? This is all, I think, what we're trying to get back to through various ways. And so when there's a disconnect from ourselves and other people, it causes us pain, right? And so there's a disconnection from the reality system, like racism, and therefore from people of color, because we keep denying their experiences. The second one is a disconnection from yourself and your emotional system. As I've been talking about, compassion is a natural emotion that arises in the presence of pain, where you want to alleviate what is causing that pain, right? And so when you don't have that feeling and you want to deny that that's something racist, right? And you want to minimize the impact, you gotta think about, okay, what's getting in the way of me seeing the violence for what it is, right? And then the third pain is a fear of disconnection from other white folks who haven't developed a level of racial consciousness yet. And so as you start to talk about racism, the fear that you will be rejected by your own community, by your friends, by your family, right? It's all disconnection. We're going to unpack that a little bit more. So the first one is the pain of disconnection from the reality systemic racism and from other people of color, right? And Dara, if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I think one of the things for me as a white person is that sort of what draws me into doing this work is wanting to be connected to a broader community, wanting to be connected both to my people who are Jewish and who are white, and to a broader community, and to be dismantling white supremacy and racism as we're moving forward. So this disconnection from the reality of systemic racism and from people of color, one of the ways that we're taught this is that whiteness is the norm.
Let's talk about systemic racism and the Jews, the most persecuted people throughout entire span of human existence. More so than the Africans, more so than the Asians, more so than anyone else, the Jews have been persecuted. And most people, when they think about the persecution of Jews, they think World War II. It goes way beyond that. It's not something that's brand new. Yeah, they basically killed Christ, but the Christians never forgot that. Throughout history, since that time, even before that, the Romans persecuted the Jews before the death of Christ. But Jews were constantly under threat from a local community. They were often accused of practicing witchcraft, or constantly accused of poisoning the well, or even poisoning doorknobs. I mean, especially during the bubonic plague, because the Jews actually practice a level of sanitation above that of Christians. They were accused of the ones creating the plague or spreading the plague around. One of the things that came up in my research for my book was King Philip, I think it was the 4th or something like that, but right around the 1400s, right before he basically arrested the Templars because he was hard up for money, he raided a Jewish town, arrested as many people as he could, and forced the others away just so he could ransack their homes and steal their valuables. Jews have been hated more than blacks in history. And in fact, Jews started off as, a person of color. They weren't originally white, if you go back and actually look at the history of it. And then eventually they did become white, and now they're of all colors. But if systematic racism exists for, people of color, why doesn't it exist for Jews? Why are Jews exempt from that? At one point or another, somewhere in our history, more than likely our people were slaves. Not just the Jews, but almost any culture at one point in time in history. So why is some people's legacy more prominent than others when it comes to systematic racism?
It's that overwhelming blanket of white privilege. You're somehow perceived as being white or having white privilege, and it suddenly erases every negative thing that's happened in your life and your entire family's legacy. Everything bad happened, it's all been erased because someone says, check your privilege.